You're welcome to today's class. Today we want to look at traversing a 2D array. The last class I taught you two-dimensional array. Now, how are you going to access the elements in a two-dimensional array and then project them on the screen? That is the essence of what this class. So I'm going to write a C program to demonstrate that. Now, to traverse a 2D array, we will need a nested loop. So in this class, I'm going to use a nested for loop, right, to traverse a 2D array and project them on the screen. So without wasting much time, I'm going to go straight into what? C programming language script. So, and we also see the concept of the algorithm. So step by step, algorithm is what? Start, right? So we'll do this, include stdio.h. I told you this in one of the classes that I am bringing in this library because I will need the printf function. Okay, so here I will say int main. I'm declaring my main function. And then in this, I will do, so I'm going to declare the array. I'm going to declare a two-dimensional array and I will initialize it. So I will say int max, right? Then 2, which is for the row, and 3, which is for the column. Then I will initialize. So this is my curly bracket. Then inside it, I will do 10, 20, 30, then comma. Then the other one will be 40, 50, and what? 60. Right? Then I'll close this. So this is me declaring and initializing my array at the same time. Right? So I've done that, two-dimensional array, 2 rows and what? 3 columns. So I'm having the mark 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Now, I'm going to use a nested for loop to be able to traverse this array. So to do that, I'm also going to declare 2 loop counters, which is what? I and j. So int. Now, because both are integers, so I'm going to declare them on the same line. Int I, comma, j. Right? So these are 2 loop counters. So I'm having something like this. So this is I, and then this is what? J. Now, I'm going to start my nested for loop. So for in bracket. So I'm going to point this I counter to what? To 0, which is what? The index of the first row. So this is going to give me something of this nature. Right? Index 0, index 1, column 0, that is row 1, row 0, row 1, column 0, column 1, column 2. So 3 columns. So I'm having 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60 inside. So this is how it is. Now, I am going to point this loop counter to what? To this guy. So I will say I assign 0. Then, so I'm writing my for loop condition. So I will repeat this until I less than what? Row is what? 2. Less than 2. Right? Then I will increment my I. Then inside this, so it is a nested for loop. So a loop inside a loop, because when I access this first row, I have to traverse all the columns before I access the second row, and then traverse all the columns. So inside this place, I will say for, then j, I will point j to the index of the first column. So this is j, and then this is I. So I'll point it to this. Then I will repeat until j is less than what? 3. Since I have 1, 2, 3, less than 3. But the indices are what? 0, 1, 2. That's why it is less than 3. then j plus plus, right? Then I close this. Then inside this place, it is inside here I'm going to print my function. I'm going to call my printf percentage %d, a format specifier, right? And it's going to expect max, right? Yeah, max, array name. So I, j. So I'm closing this and then close my for loop. And then here I'll say printf, right? In this place, I'll say new line, right? Then I will close this, my loop. I'll close it here. But my program has not finished because you are no longer going to see the bottom. So I will come here and I'll finish it, right? What I want to write here now should be at the bottom. So I'll say return 0. Then this curly bracket for my main function, I'm going to close it here. So this is for this. So this is my nested for loop to traverse the array. So let's clean this up. So what is it going to do? Now, I will have this I, and I will have this j, right? Then for my for loop, I've initialized I and j. I've declared I and j, memory space is created like this. Then inside my first for loop, I am pointing I to the first index, so which is I is 0. Now to check, I is less than 2. That is true. So it will come in. So it tests the condition. The condition is true. It will come in. Then it will assign 0 to what? To j. So it will point this to 0. Then j is less than 3. That is true. It will come in here. And then this is a format specifier telling you how to interpret the binary digit you are going to see in the memory. Because that 10, 20, 30, 40 is stored as 0 and 1 in the memory. So it's telling you go to the realm of integer in order to be able to interpret that 0 and 1 that you'll be seeing. That is what this format specifier is telling you. Okay, now it's coming to this address, max I and j. So at this point, I is 0, j is 0. That is what it is. So whatever is there, right, which we've seen, so we're having 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So this is 0, this is 1, this is 2, this is 0, this is 1. So this is I, and this is j. So the address, I taught you in the last class how the system is going to calculate the address for a two-dimensional array in the memory. So I is 0, right? This is I is 0, j is 0, so this is 0. So it's going to return this, right? So it's going to print out 10 on the screen. Then it will encounter this curly bracket. Then it will increment j. Now, for every I, it will have to traverse j complete. For every I, when it comes in, it's going to repeat j the complete times before coming out again to I. So I is 0, right? J is 0. So it's going to print out 0, 0. That is 10, right? Then it will encounter this guy. And then it will increment j to 1. So j becomes 1. I is still 0. Then it will check. 1 is less than 3. That is true. It will come in. So it will print out the element in mark 0 and 1. So I is still 0, j is 1. So this one is to print out 20, right? Then it will encounter this again. It will increment j to 2, right? 2 is less than 3. That is true. It will come in. So max 0, 2. So 0, 2. It will print out 30, right? Then it will increment j to 3. So 3 is less than 3. That is no longer true. So it will not enter this. it will come out of this loop. It will encounter this one. You are still in the for loop. It will encounter this guy. This guy is saying, go to a new line. So it will create space here, and it will come to a new line. Then it will increment. Now it is out of this loop. Is here. It will encounter this guy. So it will increment I to 1. I will become 1. When it left this for loop, J reset to 0. Right? So I is now 1. 1 is less than 2. That is true. It will come in. J is equals to 0. Right? It will test the condition of J. J is less than 3. That is true. It will come in here and print. So it will look for I is 1. I is 1. J is what? 0. So this. So it will print out 40. Then it will increment J, right, to 1. J to 1. Then it will test. J is less than 3. That is true. It will come in. Max. I is 1. J is 1. So I is 1. J is 1. It will print out 50. It will calculate the address using the formula. And then it will print out what is in that address, which is what? 50. Then it will encounter this curly bracket. So it will increment J to what? To 2. So J will become 2. 2 is less than 3. That is true. So it will come in. Mark. I is what? 1. J is what? 2. So I is 1. J is 2. It will print out 60. Then it will encounter this guy. Then it will increment J to 3. So J is now 3. So it will test the condition. 3 is less than 3. That is not true. So it will skip this, right? And then it will come to this guy. So it will go to a new line. Then it will increment I. I becomes 2. Then it will test I. I is less than 2 is less than 2. That is not true. So it will skip this. And then it will encounter this guy, return to 0. Meaning it's returning to the operating system that I've completely executed my program without any error. So this is the end of the program. So this will be printed out on the screen. So that is how you traverse the element of a 2D array using a nested for loops. That is what I want to demonstrate to you in this class. So if you have come with me this far, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. So let's go to code blocks and let me quickly demonstrate this for you to see practically. So this is our array. I've also written it in our code blocks. Now this is it, included stdio.h. I've explained that on this screen, on the board. Now these are my two-dimensional array, 2 rows and 3 columns, and these are the numbers. Now I'm going to traverse this array and print this out on the screen. So this is what I explained to you on the board. So I'm just going to execute this script for you to see how it is going to come out. Now, build and run. So you see? That is it. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. That is all. So this script, this is what it's giving you. That is what I want to show you in this class. So till we see in the next class, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. And if you have not subscribed, please do so. Bye-bye.